Hello everybody, and welcome to the second webinar in a four-part series brought to you by Threshold. Now, before we get started today, I'd like to draw your attention to the right-hand side of the YouTube page in front of you. This chat box is a great opportunity for us to communicate with you live during the session. We invite you to say hello, leave comments, and ask questions, which we can answer live during the session. This webinar series is titled Securing Assets, a 360-degree outlook. And this episode focuses on keyless wallets, removing the risk of private key theft. This is a keynote session which will be delivered by our friends and partners at Sepior. So I'd like to welcome to you the Chief Executive Officer, Ahmet Tuncay, the Chief Technology Officer, Jakob Pagter, and Chief Marketing Officer, Wiener. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Sepior.
Thank you to the NABU team for inviting us to participate in this event, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As a quick reminder, feel free to submit questions anytime during this session, and we'll do our best to answer them. I'm Wiener, Chief Marketing Officer at Sepior, and co-founder and Executive Director of the MPC Alliance. Joining me on this session today is Ahmet Tuncay, Chief Executive Officer of Sepior, and Dr. Jakob Pagter, a highly regarded industry expert on multi-party computation, who also happens to be the co-founder and chief technology officer at Sepior. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Sepior is recognized as the pioneer and leader in the development and real-world deployment of multi-party computation. MPC is a technology that was invented to preserve privacy and protect secrets using a decentralized trust model. Sepior is focused on using MPC to protect the private keys that secure digital assets under custody. We've been working with some of the most advanced cryptocurrency exchanges, custody providers, and third-party wallet providers in the world to develop institutional-grade wallets with industry-leading performance, scale, and security. Security schemes have historically required us to put all of our trust into some central party to protect our interests. A variety of these schemes have been employed to protect the private keys used to transfer digital assets such as HSMs, cold wallets, hot wallets, paper wallets, etc. But in all prior cases, the existence of the private key in a complete form has created a critical vulnerability, because anyone who has access to the private key also has access to the digital assets. This simple reality resulted in billions of dollars in lost crypto assets, as we reviewed in episode 1 of this webinar series. MPC and Threshold Cryptography introduced the opportunity to decentralize trust and eliminate the existence of private keys as a complete entity. Doing so dramatically reduces the potential for key theft or misuse. To understand this better, let's have Jakob provide us with a general introduction to MPC and its application in Threshold Cryptography. Jakob?
Thanks, Frank, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So MPC, or multi-party computation, is essentially a cryptographic technology which allows a number of parties to jointly compute some function while keeping the inputs to that function secret. A popular example in the literature is that of a group of people wanting to find out who from the group is the richest, with nobody wanting to reveal their actual wealth. Using MPC, it is in fact possible to achieve this by running a so-called MPC protocol, where each party effectively submits their wealth in encrypted form, and the protocol will then compute the result without decrypting those numbers, yet being able to find out who has the highest number. In this example about comparing wealth, we use an input from a different input from each different party, but in many other cases in MPC, inputs represent so-called secret shares of sensitive values of more general value, and MPC effectively allows the parties to compute any function on the encrypted versions of those sensitive values. A simple example of how this might work, we might have Frank and Ahmet, who are here today, help me solve the problem of simply computing the sum of two two integers or two numbers that they don't know. So let's say that we have a number A, which is 20, and a number B, which is 12. And then for A, I will tell Frank the so-called secret share, which in this case will be a random value. So let's say 11. And then Ahmet will have the corresponding secret share, which is the value 9. So you can notice that these numbers together add to the value 20. And similarly for the number B, which was 12, I will tell Frank the random number 7 and Ahmet the number 5. So now none of these, my two colleagues, will actually know anything about A or B unless, of course, they're listening to this recording. Now, the following MPC protocol can compute the sum of A and B. Frank will simply add his numbers and publish the sum, which is 18. And Ahmet can do the same and publish the sum, which is 14. Now, if they add these two numbers together, these public numbers, they get the total sum, which is 32, which is indeed the sum of 20 and 12. And we notice the very important property that neither Frank nor Ahmet knows anything about A and B. They just know their sum and the sum of these random numbers which they were given. So this actually shows you how you can compute the sum of two numbers which are effectively encrypted, that the people who are doing the computation, they don't know the values. Of course, computation in general is a bit more than just adding numbers. But if you go back to formal basic computer science, we actually know that if you can just do addition and multiplication of numbers, we can perform any arithmetic operation that a modern CPU can do, which means that we can emulate any operation a CPU can do. In the example above, the intuitive solution for doing multiplication would be that you add A to itself B times. But since you don't know what B is, it's being secret, you have to do something which is a bit more complicated than that. And I'm not going to go into that, but that's essentially how you do multi-party computation based on secret sharing. Now, the concept of threshold cryptography is based on the insight that a cryptographic cipher is quote unquote just a function. So it can be done by different operations like addition and multiplication. And by secret sharing, the cryptographic key that we use to compute this function, it becomes possible to perform cryptographic operation using key material which has never been available to any one party. The word threshold comes from the fact that when secret sharing and doing MPC amongst n parties instead of just 2 as we did before, it is actually possible to define a threshold so that up to T parties are allowed to be dishonest without being able to compromise the security of the MPC protocol. So this means that we can do threshold cryptography and we can have work with a threshold of T.
Great, and thanks, Jakob, for those explanations. Ahmet, before I joined the company, Sepior was already recognized by Gartner as a leader in MPC in Sepior's introduction of the first cloud-native key management as a service platform. Sepior's focus with that initiative was to decentralize key management of the private keys used for encryption and decryption services of cloud-based content. Then in the fall of 2018, Sepior announced the industry's first MPC-based wallet. That announcement introduced the application of MPC and threshold signatures to secure custodial wallets used by cryptocurrency exchanges, over-the-counter brokers, and custody providers. Perhaps you can provide some of the drivers behind the decision to expand the application and focus of MPC to provide institutional-grade wallet security.
Sure, Frank, thank you. So Sepior was founded in 2014 as a spin-out from the University of Aarhus in Denmark by a group of world-leading researchers and entrepreneurs in the field of cryptography and secure MPC. And the founders of Sepior are the same team that developed the sugar beet price matching system for Danisco back in 2008. Danisco is a private Danish company that used to conduct a blind they used to conduct an auction for price matching between sugar beet growers and buyers. And this tended to be a contentious and a difficult auction. And the thought was that this could be automated using a secret or a blind auction scheme. And that was actually the first practical use of MPC. And the papers were published around 2008, and that is essentially the same team that founded Sepior. What made this possible? Of course, MPC had been around for almost 2 decades by this time, but what really made this practical system possible was a breakthrough in performance of MPC computations in the secret. Some of the protocols, the modern protocols that we have, are many orders of magnitude faster than the theoretical work that MPC was based on, and this makes MPC very, very attractive and practical in the auction setup. So the founders worked together for a number of years, between 2008 and 2014, including a blind auction system for electricity trading, the selling of national licensed spectrum, a number of projects around secure statistics. But around 2014, the company was awarded a EU grant, a European Union grant, to develop the world's first secure MPC-based cryptographic key management system. And what was unique about this particular project was that the goal was to develop a pure cloud, pure software key management as a service, a enterprise-grade key management as a service. The initial use case targeted multi-cloud bring your own key, or customer managed keys for document signing and enterprise-grade file sharing. Around that time, around 2018, this was a very exciting period for cryptocurrencies, particularly Bitcoin, where we saw the prices of these assets go through the roof. But the unknown action was really taking place on the part of the regulators in various countries. And in some countries like Japan, the financial regulators started licensing virtual currency traders, brokers, trusts, exchanges, and these licenses permitted these entities to operate, providing custodial services, trading services for cryptocurrency assets. While some of these entities were new, of course, many others, because of the regulation, particularly in Japan, many others were established fintech companies. They were entities with commercial banking operations, trust operations, insurance businesses, and of course, these entities also saw the opportunity to offer a much higher grade custodial service, backed by insurance and various security assurances that were not available from the newcomers. And SBI Holdings of Japan, which is one of the largest fintech companies based out of Japan, and they wanted to participate in this virtual currency economy, but in a much more secure way. And their requirements were very typical of what a bank and a regulator would demand. Things like absolute security, internal and external controls to guarantee the most secure operations that are possible in a banking environment. But more so, to find the right balance between liquidity and security, because even back in 2018, it was well understood that very secure cold wallets could be created as in air-gap systems or offline systems. But in order to conduct a trade, one must have the assets on a hot wallet, and the hot wallet is basically where things are signed and transactions are approved. So this is how we came to develop threshold signatures and a number of related components to that, Frank.
Outstanding. Next, I'd like to step through some of the high-level attributes of keyless MPC-based threshold signature wallet and why many people refer to threshold signatures as the next generation of wallet security, or crypto security 2.0. As we know, multi-party approval is absolutely essential for any custodial wallet service. The vulnerabilities of single-party approval schemes have resulted in billions of dollars in stolen assets. Single-party schemes are simply insufficient for custodial and other institutional-grade services. Multisig was introduced for Bitcoin in 2014. It greatly improved the security over the single-party schemes, but it also introduced increased complexity, cost, and new vulnerabilities. Nearly 6 years after the first multisig wallet became available, less than 1 out of 3 Bitcoins are secured using multisig today. Clearly, there's room for more compelling multi-party approval schemes. MPC and threshold signatures provide such a scheme. They provide all of the multi-party security benefits of multisig, plus additional security enhancements, while eliminating undesirable attributes of multisig. Perhaps as importantly, threshold sig creates the opportunity to dramatically reduce operational complexities, the associated costs, and the associated delays, which are common with conventional custody services in general. Think of it as a clean slate for offering more compelling custody services. Ahmet, please walk us through the basic multi-party approval model with threshold signatures.
Thanks, Frank. So let's start by reviewing the conceptual framework for an MPC-based threshold signature wallet. It's in some ways you can think of it as a distributed multi-party approval wallet, similar to the multi-sig wallet that Frank mentioned. And the idea of a threshold sig wallet is to have multiple parties independently confirm their approval before the transaction can be completed, signed off, and executed. Throughout this process, the critical objective of threshold MPC is to eliminate the existence of an entire key so that no single party can ever be hacked. To mitigate this key vulnerability and facilitate the requirements for a multi-party approval, MPC creates a distributed virtual wallet across a number of parties. For threshold MPC and threshold signatures, the number of parties involved in a transaction can be as small as 2, or it could be a larger number, theoretically up to 20 parties. But in typical cases, 3 or 4 parties are more than enough and actually fit the business model and what the regulators are looking for in a system like this. So in this example, we're showing an example of a threshold wallet. You know, what we have in the middle is the institution, or in this case, in our case, that might be the SPI virtual currency trade desk, or one of their own operations. And on the left, we have a client, and the client might be initiating transactions on a mobile device or a server or a laptop and whatnot. And on the right side, we have an emergency recovery service. And the idea behind this is that even if all the participants in a threshold signing scheme are compromised somehow, if the mobile device is lost, or if a client wants to change their broker or move their assets to a different wallet or whatever, and even in the most imaginable worst case scenario, assets are protected and they must not be lost. And the way to do that is to provide a service where the everything is escrowed, but also in an encrypted fashion. But it's important to remember that the escrow agents should not be able to initiate transactions or even participate in the signing of a transaction. The other components shown here are three approvers of a transaction out of a hot wallet. So we have a customer, the exchange, who can provide a zero confirmation trade. And the important thing about that is that not only do the trades have to be liquid, not only do the assets have to be liquid, but the trades have to be conducted in extremely high throughput, a high number of transactions per second. Also, in this case, the broker or the exchange must be able to confirm that the assets belong to the customer and exist. So zero confirmation trade can be done with such a participant. And on the right side, there's a trusted third party, and the trusted third party might be providing some other services, some assurance services, or some policy enforcement associated with the transaction. So in this example that we'll walk through, let's assume that the number of parties involved in a transaction in a signing are three. Party one could actually be a client. This could be the owner of the asset. Party two could be a custodial exchange or a broker. And party three is potentially a trusted third party. And there might be additional parties also involved in the transaction if things such as recovery service are mandated. In this scenario, the transaction will be initiated by any one of the parties, or depending on the policy, one specific party. And at setup time, the MPC protocol will generate a secret key, a secret share of the private key in each node, depending on the number of parties. None of these parties know anything about any information of any other party. So all their entire knowledge is really their own private key. However, as we'll see, they can each generate a partial signature, which can be combined by the protocol to generate a full signing key. The real main benefit of this is that since the keys are generated in a distributed fashion, and the partial signatures are also generated in a distributed fashion, the key materials are never combined in use or actually in storage. So this is an important key concept to understand. When a transaction is submitted for approval, it's presented to each party. Actually, each party can generate its own signature. And these parties are typically machines or client devices running algorithms. So this can be automated, or it can be initiated by a human, or some combination thereof. And of course, each party must satisfy a predefined set of criteria for approval before they can elect to approve the transaction. And this is actually driven by the policy requirements of generating the signature. Such policy can be almost any number of checkpoints that a particular broker, customer, or exchange wishes to enforce, and that policy layer is typically specific to the setup. In the actual MPC protocol, it can be, but it's generally not necessary to know much about the policy or the criteria. The protocol is optimized to generate a signature as quickly as possible. While we're on this topic, we should mention that many of these scenarios have expectations of processing a large number of transactions per second. So the throughput is almost a deal breaker in a scenario like this. So the MPC protocols must be very quick if if the goal is to provide a large number of transactions per second, as I mentioned. And in order to achieve this, we've developed a number of schemes to do pre-processing that accelerate the whole transaction process. So once these criteria are satisfied, each signature is used in conjunction with the other signatures, and the MPC protocols are able to generate the full signature based on the partial signatures. Once the complete signature is assembled, the transaction is deemed approved. Of course, it's subject to, by this time it has satisfied the criteria established by the policies and other necessary check-off points. But this is only possible after all of the defined parties have actually have provided their signature. So a couple of points of interest are worth highlighting. The MPC nodes, the parties that we've talked about, could be any device. Could be a laptop, could be a server, could be a mobile device, a mobile phone. But it's important to remember that MPC protocols can run on virtually any machine, and they can be optimized to perform in the environment that it's running in. As we mentioned earlier, key shares are generated locally, and the actual shares are really never they never have to leave the client device or the server. There may be reasons to export encrypted key shares for things like emergency recovery services, but those are optional in any given setup, and they're really not essential to how MPC works. While the signatures are being generated, no information is actually leaked from any client device. That's secret, and no information about the private key or the key shares is learned about any of the other clients. So the bottom line is that multiple parties are set up and identified as approvers. MPC generates a share of a common key on the nodes controlled by each approver. And when a party approves a transaction, MPC generates a partial signature. And only when enough partial signatures, which is the threshold defined by the protocol, are available, and they have generated their partial signatures, can a full signature be generated. And once a full signature is generated, this one signature looks very much like a single signature approval in terms of the what's actually done on chain once the transaction has been approved. So this sounds a little bit complicated, but in reality, it's very efficient, and it's a much better way to approve a transaction than any other multi-party approval scheme.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ahmet. Jakob, perhaps you can expand a bit further to describe the concept of thresholds and how they pertain to subsets of approving parties, and the ability of operations to proceed securely, even if some of the parties become unavailable or even worse, corrupted. Jakob?
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, as the name implies, threshold signatures support the ability to essentially specify a threshold for the number of parties that needs to approve a transaction. That is, in this case, to generate a signature using MPC. In the cryptocurrency domain, we typically refer to this number as M. And you may recall from my short introduction to MPC and threshold cryptography that here we use the parameter T for the number of corrupt parties we can tolerate. And in fact, it turns out that what we need here is that what we in the cryptocurrency world calls M, this will typically be T+1 or sometimes higher. So this means that for 2 out of 3 signature scheme, this means that once the private key associated with the wallet address has been generated, with secret shares being held by 3 parties, as shown in the example by Ahmet before. We have 3 parties or 3 approvers. Then any 2 of those can execute a distributed protocol to generate a signature and thus approve a transaction. The intuition from the 2 or 3 setup, this means that we can tolerate one key being unavailable, and that intuition is completely correct. So if M is 2, then T is 1, if you want to go into that piece of arithmetic. And this is exactly the availability property we would expect from a 2 out of 3 setup. So this kind of ties together those concepts from the general MPC and threshold cryptography and what we know from the cryptocurrency world. So in principle, our threshold SIG supports any combination of M and N, as long as N is smaller than, say, a number like 20 perhaps. But really, we typically see deployments of setups which are very similar to 2 out of 3 and that range. On top of that, there are multiple options for wallet providers to layer on flexible quorum controls, where one of the threshold SIG approvers is actually controlled by their own M of N quorum. Sounds a bit confusing, but it's actually straightforward when you work with it. I believe Saibabo will elaborate on that in an upcoming episode of this webinar series. The bottom line on growth at the threshold SIG layer is we want to be as large as required, but no larger than we can still optimize performance within the bounds of attaining the needed security level. Our implementation, Sepior's implementation of threshold SIG, can execute an approval and generate partial signatures in milliseconds, but in general, we prefer to keep systems as simple as possible for optimal performance and efficiency.
Great, and thank you both. At this point, it might be useful to step back and think about the implications of threshold signatures. Threshold SIG gives us a multi-party approval scheme, which is similar in function to multi-sig, but does so without the complexity, added expense, inconsistencies, or vulnerabilities of multi-sig. Let's take a closer look by contrasting threshold SIG with multi-sig. First, we'll start with universal digital asset support. Threshold SIG produces a standard single signature, which is natively supported by every digital asset in every ledger. No special smart contracts or coding is required. In contrast, multi-sig requires special coding or smart contracts because blockchains lack the ability to record multiple approver signatures per transaction. Next is increased transaction privacy. With multi-sig, the public address information for each party that approves a transaction is recorded on-chain in the public domain. As approvers are added and removed, those changes are also recorded on-chain. In the realm of security and privacy, the less information disclosed, the better. Multi-sig clearly violates this premise. Threshold SIG is completely different. One signature associated with one public address is recorded for each transaction, regardless of the number of approving parties that actually approve the transaction. No information is disclosed about the number of approvers, any changes in the approver lineup, etc. Reduced mining fees is another potentially big difference, especially as smaller, more frequent transactions become common. Single signatures have the lowest mining fees, so threshold SIG is always the lowest cost. In contrast, multi-sig records multiple signatures and public key addresses with each transaction. This subsequently increases the transaction size, which means fewer transactions per fixed length block. So naturally, miners charge more for processing multi-sig transactions than they do for single signatures. Paying higher fees is never satisfying, but what's more concerning is the risk of delaying processing that can happen with multi-sig, which is due to the larger transaction size and reduced throughput. Reduced key management complexity is another area of differentiation. A threshold SIG wallet uses just one key, regardless of the number of approvers. And each share is locally generated on each node, so no distribution of key shares is required. In contrast, a typical 2 of 3 wallet will require the generation of 3 times the number of keys. The result is key management complexity is reduced dramatically with threshold SIG. Finally, let's talk about static address support. A best practice for key security is to rotate or refresh keys on a periodic basis to reduce the potential that a corrupt party might have gained access to some of the keys or key shares. With multi-sig, the key shares cannot be refreshed without also changing the public key address. In contrast, Threshold SIG supports the ability to refresh key shares as frequently as you like without changing the private or public key. This means your published address for deposits can remain the same. What I find most compelling about MPC and Threshold SIG is that the security achieved with online wallets can be as secure and in some ways more secure than offline cold storage. This can be a game changer for custodians and institutions because they can provide custody services without the cost or complexity of using air-gapped cold storage. Of course, Threshold SIG can be used in conjunction with cold storage if there's a desire or a requirement to do so. It's just that cold storage isn't required to provide custody-grade security. In fact, Threshold signatures can support multi-party approval of air-gapped cold storage solutions as well, but that's the subject of another session. So let's step back and summarize what we've covered today. MPC is a security scheme that decentralizes trust across multiple parties to improve the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Threshold signatures use MPC to protect the private keys, which generate signatures and release assets for transfer to another party. Sepior is a leader and pioneer in MPC and Threshold signatures. We developed Threshold SIG in close collaboration with SBI. Sepior Threshold SIG is a multi-party approval scheme with the following attributes. M of N approver schemes. MPC generates shares locally on each party's node. Each key share is used to generate a partial signature. When M approvers have generated their partial signature, a full signature is generated and recorded on the blockchain. Tolerance for up to T corrupt parties. And finally, sustained and secure operations, even if less than N parties are operational. And of course, there are many other benefits over multi-sig. Ultimately, the key takeaway from this session is that Threshold signatures use MPC to enable a disruptive new approach to custodial wallet security. Threshold SIG provides the liquidity of hot wallets, which everyone wants, with the security of cold storage, which everyone needs. Well, I think that covers it for this session. Again, I want to thank Nabu for hosting this webinar series and for my co-panelists, Ahmet and Jakob, for joining us today. We invite you to visit Sepior.com to learn more about Sepior's MPC technology licensing and our consulting services. Thanks and have a great day.
Thanks, Frank. We'd like to say a massive thank you to the Sepior team, Ahmet, Jakob, and Frank. That was a fantastic introduction to MPC, threshold cryptography, and removing the risk of private key theft. Now, if you'd like some more information about Threshold, please visit our website, www.threshold.com. Alternatively, you can contact us directly via email at sales@threshold.com or via Twitter @thresholduk. The next session will focus on infrastructure security beyond the private key. And we welcome our friends and partners at Cybervo with keynote speaker Roberto Machado, the Chief Product Officer. In the YouTube description box, there is the sign-up link for both of these sessions. So please go ahead and grab your ticket now. Thank you very much for joining this session, and we look forward to seeing you next time.